They call it one of the most controlled places in America. Steel doors, cameras everywhere, federal oversight down to the inch. But according to court filings and news reports, men have been killed here without a single guard pulling the trigger. One inmate later told investigators, "In Beaumont, the silence is louder than the screams." It was designed to be unbreakable until violence became routine. If you want more real, fact-based prison documentaries, like and subscribe now. What you're about to hear is not a movie. It's the reality inside one of America's most feared federal prisons. The first thing you notice about USP Beaumont is how deliberately ordinary it looks. From the outside, it doesn't resemble a fortress. No towering walls like the old penitentiaries. No dramatic guard towers cutting the skyline. According to Bureau of Prisons planning documents, that was intentional. Beaumont was designed to control people psychologically before force ever became necessary. Opened as part of the Beaumont Federal Correctional Complex in southeast Texas, the facility sits far from major cities, surrounded by long stretches of highway and flat land. Inmates transferred here often describe the location as isolating by design. Court testimony from multiple federal cases confirms that distance plays a role. Family visits are rare, legal access is limited, and news from the outside arrives slowly. Inside, everything runs on routine. Counts, movements, lockdowns. According to Bureau of Prisons policy manuals, predictability is supposed to prevent chaos. But former inmates and federal lawsuits tell a different story. They describe a place where order exists on paper, while violence simmers underneath. By the early 2010s, USP Beaumont had already appeared in multiple federal complaints alleging inmate-on-inmate assaults, contraband trafficking, and staff misconduct. Some claims were proven in court. Others were dismissed or remain unconfirmed. What is clear, according to investigative reporting, is that Beaumont developed a reputation inside the federal system, a prison where power is enforced not just by officers, but by inmates themselves. Transfers into Beaumont were often described as a warning. According to former inmates interviewed by journalists, the message was simple: survive, submit, or disappear into the system. And for many who entered those gates, the real sentence didn't begin in the courtroom. It began here. The first night inside USP Beaumont is when most illusions die. According to sworn statements from former inmates and details cited in federal civil lawsuits, arrivals are processed quickly and without ceremony. Belongings are inventoried. Paperwork is signed. Warnings are minimal. By the time the cell door closes for the first time, many inmates realize they were never truly prepared for where they've landed. Unlike lower security federal facilities, Beaumont operates on a constant undercurrent of tension. Former prisoners interviewed by journalists consistently describe an unspoken rule: respect is not requested, it's tested. The first 24 hours matter. Who you talk to, where you sit, whether you look confident or afraid. Court filings from multiple assault cases show a pattern. New arrivals are often targeted, not randomly, but strategically. According to testimony, certain inmates act as shot callers, individuals who enforce order on behalf of larger prison groups. These power structures are not acknowledged officially, but prosecutors and investigators have repeatedly referenced them in indictments involving organized prison violence. One former inmate, identified in court documents under a protected name, described his first night as silent but violent. He said no one spoke to him directly, yet every movement felt watched. The noise never stopped: metal doors, distant shouts, radios crackling, but no one explained the rules. According to Bureau of Prisons incident reports later obtained by reporters, assaults often occurred during this adjustment period. Not all were fatal. Some were meant to send messages. Others escalated fast. What makes Beaumont different, according to multiple legal complaints, is how quickly violence blends into routine. Fights don't always cause lockdowns. Injuries aren't always reported, and fear becomes normalized. Inside USP Beaumont, authority does not flow in a straight line. Officially, power belongs to the Bureau of Prisons. Wardens set policy. Officers enforce rules. Disciplinary hearings decide punishment. But according to federal indictments, inmate testimony, and investigative reporting, there is a second system operating alongside the official one: quieter, faster, and often more feared. Prosecutors have repeatedly described inmate-run hierarchies in federal prisons as informal governance structures. At Beaumont, those structures were shaped by race, geography, and criminal background. Court records from multiple racketeering and assault cases show that certain inmates were identified as organizers, mediators, and enforcers. They decided who could use phones safely, who could work certain jobs, who owed protection, and who didn't deserve it. Former inmates have said this power didn't come from size alone. It came from reputation, prior convictions, connections to gangs outside the walls. According to court filings, some orders were passed without words at all: a look, a placement on the unit, a refusal to intervene. What made the system dangerous, according to civil rights lawsuits, was its predictability. Once labeled, an inmate rarely escaped that role. Those seen as weak were pressured into debt. Those seen as threats were tested. And those who refused alignment often became targets. Federal investigators later acknowledged in internal reports that staff shortages and overcrowding increased reliance on inmate order. Officers, outnumbered and under pressure, sometimes focused on containment rather than prevention. That gap allowed informal leadership to solidify. Violence, when it happened, often appeared spontaneous. But according to prosecutors, many attacks followed patterns: timing during movement, use of improvised weapons, and witnesses who suddenly saw nothing. At USP Beaumont, violence didn't always look chaotic. According to court filings, incident reports, and investigative journalism, some of it followed patterns so consistent they almost resembled routine. Official Bureau of Prison Statistics acknowledge inmate-on-inmate assaults at Beaumont over multiple years. What the numbers don't show is timing. Former inmates and federal lawsuits describe how attacks often occurred during predictable windows: early morning movement, late-night counts, or moments when staffing was thinnest. One federal civil complaint filed by an injured inmate alleged that officers were aware of escalating threats days before an assault occurred. According to the filing, no housing change was approved. No separation order was enforced. The attack happened during routine movement, just as predicted. Weapons were rarely manufactured in dramatic ways. According to confiscation reports cited in court, they were improvised: sharpened metal, pieces of fencing, altered tools from prison jobs. Nothing elaborate, nothing traceable, enough to maim or kill. News reports confirmed that multiple violent incidents at Beaumont resulted in emergency medical responses and lockdowns. In some cases, details were withheld pending investigation. In others, internal reviews concluded that policy had been followed, even when serious injuries occurred. Former inmates have described a grim understanding. Violence that disrupted operations brought consequences. Violence that stayed contained often didn't. Fights that ended quickly. Attacks with no witnesses. Injuries that could be explained as accidents. According to sworn testimony in a federal assault case, some inmates believed timing an attack correctly was the difference between discipline and silence. That belief shaped behavior. Fear, over time, became scheduled too. People learned when to stay alert, when not to shower, when not to stand near doors. Survival depended on reading the rhythm of the unit. Protection inside USP Beaumont was never free. According to court testimony and investigative reporting, it often came with conditions that quietly tightened over time. At first, protection looked like safety. Standing with the right people meant fewer tests, fewer confrontations, fewer threats during movement. Former inmates told journalists that alignment could feel like relief, someone watching your back in a place designed to break you. But federal court filings paint a darker picture. Protection quickly turned into obligation. Once associated, inmates were expected to contribute: commissary items, labor, silence, or participation in activities they never agreed to at the start. Refusal, according to sworn affidavits, was interpreted as betrayal. Several assault cases prosecuted in federal court referenced disputes that began over protection arrangements. In one case, cited in sentencing documents, an inmate was attacked after attempting to distance himself from a group he claimed had become controlling. Prosecutors argued the assault was meant to reassert authority. What made escape difficult, according to former inmates, was visibility. Once aligned, everyone knew. Staff, other inmates, opposing groups. Leaving didn't reset your status, it exposed you. Some inmates attempted protective custody. According to Bureau of Prisons policy, it exists to prevent harm. But civil lawsuits allege that requesting protection could carry its own consequences: restricted movement, loss of privileges, and increased isolation. For many, it felt like another form of punishment. Investigators later acknowledged in internal assessments that informal protection systems flourished where official safety mechanisms were stretched thin. Overcrowding and staffing shortages made individual monitoring difficult, allowing inmate-enforced control to fill the gap. By the time some inmates realized protection had become a cage, they had few options left: stay and submit. Protection inside USP Beaumont was never free. According to court testimony and investigative reporting, it often came with conditions that quietly tightened over time. At first, protection looked like safety. Standing with the right people meant fewer tests, fewer confrontations, fewer threats during movement. Former inmates told journalists that alignment could feel like relief, someone watching your back in a place designed to break you. But federal court filings paint a darker picture. Protection quickly turned into obligation. Once associated, inmates were expected to contribute: commissary items, labor, silence, or participation in activities they never agreed to at the start. Refusal, according to sworn affidavits, was interpreted as betrayal. Several assault cases prosecuted in federal court referenced disputes that began over protection arrangements. In one case, cited in sentencing documents, an inmate was attacked after attempting to distance himself from a group he claimed had become controlling. Prosecutors argued the assault was meant to reassert authority. What made escape difficult, according to former inmates, was visibility. Once aligned, everyone knew: staff, other inmates, opposing groups. Leaving didn't reset your status, it exposed you. Some inmates attempted protective custody. According to Bureau of Prisons policy, it exists to prevent harm. But civil lawsuits allege that requesting protection could carry its own consequences: restricted movement, loss of privileges, and increased isolation. For many, it felt like another form of punishment. Investigators later acknowledged in internal assessments that informal protection systems flourished where official safety mechanisms were stretched thin. Overcrowding and staffing shortages made individual monitoring difficult, allowing inmate-enforced control to fill the gap. By the time some inmates realized protection had become a cage, they had few options left: stay and submit. USP Beaumont is saturated with surveillance. According to Bureau of Prisons documentation, cameras monitor housing units, corridors, recreation areas, and movement paths. On paper, nothing significant should happen without being recorded. But court filings and investigative reporting tell a more complicated story. In multiple federal assault cases connected to Beaumont, prosecutors and defense attorneys referenced missing footage, obstructed camera angles, or systems that were not actively recording at critical moments. In some cases, the explanation was technical failure. In others, routine maintenance. According to court transcripts, judges often accepted these explanations, but questions remained. Former inmates described learning which areas were blind, not officially, but through experience. A corner near a stairwell. A moment during count when attention shifted. According to sworn affidavits, attacks were sometimes planned around these gaps. Civil rights lawsuits have alleged that staff were aware of malfunctioning cameras but failed to repair them promptly. The Bureau of Prisons has denied intentional neglect, stating in public responses that surveillance systems are maintained according to policy and budget constraints. What cameras couldn't capture was pressure. The looks exchanged before violence. The warnings delivered quietly. The decisions made minutes before a fight. According to investigators, by the time footage was reviewed, the story had already been shaped by silence. In one assault case cited in federal sentencing documents, the only evidence came from medical records and injuries. No witnesses. No usable video. The incident was labeled isolated. Inside the units, that label meant something else. It meant the system worked, not to prevent harm, but to contain it. At Beaumont, cameras documented movement. They did not document fear. Inside USP Beaumont, the strain wasn't limited to inmates. According to congressional testimony, Bureau of Prisons staffing reports, and internal audits cited by investigative journalists, federal prisons across the country, including Beaumont, have faced chronic staffing shortages. Fewer officers were responsible for more inmates, often working mandatory overtime. Former correctional officers interviewed by reporters described long shifts, limited backup, and constant vigilance. According to their accounts, the goal was often control, not resolution. Keep the unit moving. Prevent large-scale disturbances. Address individual conflicts only when they escalated. Federal court filings in excessive force and negligence cases reveal how pressure shaped decisions. Officers had seconds to choose between intervention and containment. Sometimes, they chose distance, not out of malice, but survival. Civil lawsuits filed by inmates allege that warnings were ignored and threats minimized. The Bureau of Prisons has publicly stated that all credible threats are assessed, but acknowledged in internal evaluations that resource constraints limit proactive monitoring. What complicated matters further was trust. Officers who intervened too aggressively risked complaints or investigations. Officers who didn't intervene risked lawsuits. According to one former supervisor's statement quoted in a media report, every move carried liability. That environment blurred responsibility. When violence occurred, blame was diffuse. Policies, staffing, inmate behavior. Rarely one decision. Rarely one person. Inside Beaumont, officers weren't invisible. They were present, watching, documenting, counting. But the system they worked in was stretched thin. And when pressure became policy, cracks were inevitable. At USP Beaumont, lockdowns weren't just a response. They were a message. According to Bureau of Prisons incident reports and media investigations, lockdowns were imposed after assaults, contraband discoveries, or intelligence suggesting retaliation. Entire housing units could be confined for days or weeks, regardless of who was involved. Former inmates described the effect as collective punishment. Movement stopped. Phones went silent. Showers were limited. According to sworn affidavits, lockdowns didn't always follow violence. Sometimes they preceded it, based on rumors or intercepted communication. Administrators defended the practice as necessary for safety. In public statements, the Bureau of Prisons has said lockdowns allow staff to restore order and prevent escalation. Critics argue they also breed resentment and desperation. Federal civil complaints allege that prolonged lockdowns increased tension rather than reduced it. With no outlets and limited information, inmates speculated. Alliances hardened. Grievances multiplied. Inside the units, lockdowns became a form of communication. If one group crossed a line, everyone felt it. According to former inmates, that pressure discouraged cooperation with investigators. No one wanted to be blamed for days in a cell. In some cases cited in court documents, violence resumed immediately after lockdowns lifted. Retaliation delayed, not prevented. The message was understood by everyone inside. Order would be restored, but not resolved. Control would return, but the cause would remain. At Beaumont, lockdown wasn't silence. It was tension, compressed, waiting for release. Inside USP Beaumont, silence was often safer than truth. According to federal court records and investigative reporting, inmates who reported threats or violence faced difficult choices. Speaking up could trigger investigations, but it could also expose them to retaliation once attention faded. Several civil rights lawsuits filed by Beaumont inmates allege that individuals who cooperated with staff were later targeted. In sworn affidavits, plaintiffs described being labeled informants, a designation that carried immediate danger. The Bureau of Prisons has denied systemic retaliation, stating that protective measures are available. Still, the fear persisted. One federal case referenced testimony from an inmate who reported an assault and was later transferred, not away from danger, but into another high-risk unit. The move followed policy, according to officials. According to the inmate, it followed punishment. Former inmates interviewed by journalists described how cooperation was quietly tracked by others inside. Conversations with staff were noticed. Movement changes were noticed. Even protective custody requests were seen as admissions. Whistleblowers weren't only inmates. According to Office of Inspector General reports, some staff members who raised concerns about safety or misconduct experienced professional consequences, reassignment, scrutiny, stalled advancement. The reports stopped short of alleging retaliation, but acknowledged a culture of caution. Over time, that culture shaped behavior. Problems were managed internally. Reports were minimized. Incidents became paperwork. At Beaumont, speaking up didn't guarantee protection. It guaranteed attention, and attention was dangerous. So most people learned the same rule: survive quietly, document nothing, and wait for transfer, if it ever came. For many inmates at USP Beaumont, hope narrowed to a single word: transfer. According to Bureau of Prisons policy, inmates can be moved for safety, medical needs, or administrative reasons. On paper, transfers are a safeguard, a way to separate threats and reduce risk. In reality, according to federal lawsuits and inmate affidavits, they were unpredictable and slow. Former inmates described submitting repeated requests after threats or assaults. Some were approved months later. Others were denied without explanation. According to court filings, decisions often cited bed space limitations or classification requirements. The danger remained. The waiting itself became a psychological burden. Each day without news reinforced the sense of being trapped. According to sworn testimony, some inmates stopped asking altogether, believing requests only marked them as weak or problematic. In a federal negligence case, attorneys argued that delayed transfers contributed directly to a client's injury. The Bureau of Prisons responded that procedures were followed and that risk assessments are ongoing. The court ultimately dismissed the claim, citing insufficient evidence of intent. Inside Beaumont, that outcome wasn't surprising. Inmates had learned that time worked differently here. Days were rigid. Years were uncertain. According to former prisoners, the promise of transfer kept people compliant, just enough hope to prevent explosion. But for many, the transfer never came. Sentences continued. Units stayed the same. Threats evolved. And slowly, the idea of escape shifted, not out of the prison, but out of expectation. Because at Beaumont, waiting wasn't temporary. It was a sentence inside the sentence. Discipline at USP Beaumont was meant to restore order. According to Bureau of Prisons regulations, infractions are handled through formal incident reports, hearings, and graduated sanctions. Loss of privileges, solitary confinement, transfer to higher security within the complex. But federal court records and investigative reporting show how discipline sometimes deepened the very problems it was meant to solve. Former inmates described a system where minor violations could escalate quickly: arguing during count, possessing excess commissary, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. According to sworn affidavits, disciplinary write-ups were occasionally used to separate inmates after conflicts, but not always to protect them. Several civil lawsuits allege that inmates placed in restrictive housing after reporting threats were effectively punished for seeking help. The Bureau of Prisons has stated that such placements are administrative, not punitive, but critics argue the distinction collapses in practice. Inside restrictive housing, tension intensified. According to court testimony, inmates returned to general population labeled as troublemakers. That label followed them, affecting housing assignments, work details, and safety. Discipline also affected staff. Officers who wrote reports faced scrutiny. Officers who didn't face blame when violence occurred. According to internal reviews cited by journalists, inconsistency became common. The result was a feedback loop. Discipline created resentment. Resentment bred defiance. Defiance triggered harsher discipline. At Beaumont, order was enforced, but trust eroded. Rules existed, but interpretation varied. And once fairness felt arbitrary, compliance became strategic rather than sincere. Discipline didn't break the system. It bent it, until something else snapped. It started like any other morning at USP Beaumont. According to incident summaries later referenced in court filings and news reports, movement was scheduled. Counts were routine. Nothing on the surface suggested what was coming. But intelligence, intercepted communication, or an unreported altercation, details remained partially unconfirmed, triggered an immediate response. Without warning, doors sealed. Units froze. Overhead announcements ordered inmates to the floor. According to former inmates' sworn statements, the lockdown spread across multiple housing areas within minutes. Sirens weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The message was clear. Federal officials later confirmed that the lockdown followed a serious security incident. No names were released. No full explanation followed. According to Bureau of Prisons statements, releasing details could compromise safety. Inside the units, speculation filled the silence. According to affidavits, some believed a weapon had been recovered. Others believed an assault had crossed an invisible line. No one knew, and no one asked. Days passed. Meals were slid through slots. Recreation stopped. Phone stayed off. According to civil complaints, tension spiked as information disappeared. When the lockdown finally lifted, nothing was explained. Movement resumed. Beds were reassigned. According to former inmates, certain faces were gone. The message was understood without words. Something had happened, and it was serious enough to remind everyone who ultimately controlled the doors. At Beaumont, lockdown wasn't a reaction. It was a reset and a warning. Official records tell one story about USP Beaumont. Former inmates tell another. According to Bureau of Prisons reports, incidents are categorized, resolved, and closed. Assaults become statistics. Lockdowns become procedural responses. Transfers become administrative actions. On paper, the system functions. But gaps appear when those records are compared to court filings and investigative reporting. In several federal lawsuits, attorneys pointed to inconsistencies, timelines that didn't align, injuries that appeared more severe than described, and reports written hours after incidents occurred. The Bureau of Prisons has stated that documentation reflects the best available information at the time. Former inmates say those gaps weren't accidents. According to sworn affidavits, some incidents were deliberately simplified to avoid scrutiny. A fight instead of an attack. An accident instead of retaliation. A medical issue instead of violence. Journalists who reviewed sealed settlements and redacted reports noted a pattern common across high-security facilities. Accountability diluted by process. No single failure. No single decision. Just layers of procedure that absorbed responsibility. That structure made reform difficult. Each case stood alone. Each outcome was justified internally. According to advocacy groups, systemic issues rarely survived legal thresholds. Inside Beaumont, inmates learned to read between the lines. If paperwork minimized an incident, it meant someone powerful wanted it quiet. If names disappeared from reports, it meant protection, not safety. The truth lived in memory, not records. In scars, not statistics. And those memories stayed long after the doors opened again. For some men, the sentence didn't end at USP Beaumont's gates. According to post-release interviews, court supervision reports, and academic studies on incarceration trauma, former inmates carried Beaumont with them long after transfer or release. The habits learned inside, constant scanning, controlled speech, emotional restraint, didn't disappear. Former prisoners described difficulty sleeping. Crowded spaces triggered alertness. Silence felt unsafe. None of this appeared in official records. According to psychologists cited in correctional research, high-security incarceration can produce long-term stress responses similar to trauma. Parole officers and reentry counselors interviewed by journalists noted patterns among those who served time at facilities like Beaumont. Hypervigilance, distrust of authority, difficulty reintegrating into structured environments. Some former inmates attempted to speak publicly. According to media reports, few used their real names. The fear followed them, not always rational, but persistent. Others stayed silent, believing the past was best buried. Federal officials maintain that rehabilitation programs exist and are expanding. Critics argue that security priorities overshadow mental health care, especially in high-risk facilities. The irony, according to one former inmate's sworn statement, was simple. You learn to survive prison. No one teaches you how to survive freedom. Beaumont's impact didn't require walls. It traveled in memory, behavior, and silence. And for many, that was the longest sentence of all. Oversight of USP Beaumont exists, but often far away. According to reports from the Department of Justice Office of the Inspector General and congressional hearings on federal prison conditions, oversight mechanisms rely heavily on audits, inspections, and internal reporting. These processes are designed to detect systemic failures. In practice, critics argue they arrive late. Investigations into federal prisons typically begin after serious incidents, deaths, riots, or public lawsuits. By the time inspectors arrive, according to investigative journalists, evidence has been filtered through layers of review. Former staff members told reporters that inspections were predictable. Units were cleaned. Staffing was temporarily increased. According to sworn statements in unrelated cases, everyone knew when oversight was coming. The Bureau of Prisons has denied claims of performative compliance, stating that inspections are rigorous and unannounced. Still, Inspector General reports have acknowledged discrepancies between policy and practice across multiple facilities. At Beaumont, Oversight often focused on compliance, counts, documentation, physical conditions. The harder questions, informal power, fear, silence, were harder to measure. Families of inmates filed complaints. Advocacy groups submitted reports. Some changes followed. Many didn't. Distance mattered. Decision-makers weren't inside the units. They didn't hear the doors slam or feel the tension shift. At Beaumont, oversight existed, but reality moved faster than reports. And by the time findings were published, the story had already changed. USP Beaumont didn't need advertising. Its reputation traveled ahead of it. According to inmate transfer records and interviews cited by investigative journalists, Beaumont was spoken about across the federal prison system as a place you didn't want to land, and a place you didn't forget. The name alone carried weight. Inmates transferred in from other federal facilities said the warnings were consistent. Keep your head down. Don't trust promises. Learn fast. According to sworn affidavits, some inmates requested transfers away from Beaumont before ever arriving, based solely on what they'd heard. Staff were aware of the reputation. Former officers interviewed by reporters acknowledged it quietly. High-security facilities attract high-risk populations, they said. Problems follow the population, not the building. But reputation affects behavior. According to correctional experts, when a prison becomes known for violence, both inmates and staff adjust expectations. Inmates prepare for conflict. Staff brace for incidents. That anticipation alone raises tension. Media coverage reinforced the image. Lawsuits, deaths, allegations. Each headline added another layer. Even when cases were dismissed or settled without findings of fault, the impression remained. Inside Beaumont, reputation became reality. Fear hardened routines. Silence became survival. According to one former inmate's statement, once you're labeled dangerous, everything that happens looks dangerous. The prison didn't have to be the worst every day. It only had to be bad often enough to be believed. And belief, inside the system, is powerful. Long after incidents fade inside the walls, paperwork remains. Every use of force, every major fight, every lockdown, every medical emergency inside a high-security federal prison generates documentation. According to federal procedure manuals and court disclosures, these reports move through multiple layers: incident logs, supervisory reviews, regional offices, and sometimes the Department of Justice itself. Years later, those documents resurface in court. Civil rights lawsuits, wrongful injury claims, and criminal prosecutions often rely on fragments of this paper trail. Investigative journalists have obtained redacted records through public records requests, revealing timelines, response delays, and internal disagreements that were never publicly announced at the time. But the paper trail is incomplete by nature. According to legal analysts, reports reflect what can be verified and what policy requires, not always what was felt, implied, or feared. Motive rarely appears in forms. Pressure is not a checkbox. Silence leaves no signature. In several federal cases connected to violent prison incidents nationwide, judges noted that official reports and witness testimony did not fully align. That doesn't automatically prove misconduct, but it confirms limitation. Documentation captures events, not environments. Former inmates have said the most important facts rarely make the file. The threat made days earlier, the tension building on a range, the warning ignored because it sounded routine. Still, when patterns repeat across reports, similar injuries, similar locations, similar timing, investigators start asking broader questions. According to oversight reviews, that's how systemic issues are sometimes discovered. At facilities like Beaumont, memory fades. Staff rotate. Inmates transfer. But the paperwork stays. And sometimes, years later, it tells a story no one meant to preserve. In the end, USP Beaumont is not just a place. It is a system, and systems are harder to judge than single events. According to Bureau of Prisons policy statements, Inspector General reviews, and federal court rulings, high-security prisons are built around one priority: control. Every schedule, every barrier, every protocol exists to prevent collapse. And by that narrow definition, the system often works. Escapes are rare. Large-scale disturbances are contained. Operations continue. But court filings, investigative reports, and sworn testimony show another truth running alongside the official one: that control and safety are not always the same thing. Order can exist while fear persists. Compliance can exist while harm goes unreported. Across the cases, complaints, and records tied to Beaumont, a pattern emerges that experts recognize across many maximum security institutions. Pressure flows downward, from policy to staff, from staff to inmates, from stronger inmates to weaker ones. Each layer absorbs strain from the one above it. Federal officials maintain that reforms are ongoing. Expanded training, increased hiring efforts, upgraded surveillance, and revised use of force guidance. Oversight bodies continue to audit and publish findings. Change, when it comes slowly and on paper first. Former inmates say the lived reality changes slower. What remains undisputed is this: once the doors close, the public rarely sees what daily life feels like inside. Understanding comes mostly through court records, verified reporting, and the voices that choose to speak after release. This documentary has followed those records and those voices, carefully, factually, and with clear limits where facts remain disputed or sealed. Because the most secure prisons are designed not just to hold people, but to hide complexity. And complexity is harder to headline than danger.